Our 5 speakers are urban planner Marcus Spiller, Director of SGS Economics and Planning, poet and environmentalist Mark O'Connor, co-author of the book Overloading Australia, Maureen Horder, CEO of the Migration Institute of Australia, economist Saul Estlake from the Grattan Institute, and Charles Berger, Director of Strategic Ideas at the Australian Conservation Foundation. I want to pick up on Marcus Spiller's comments there. Marcus, you describe a wonderful scenario of 5 or 6 vibrant cities linked by rapid, effective public transport and higher levels of density, and we can think of Melbourne as Barcelona or New York, places we all love to visit. But the problem is, it ain't happening. You know, the state of Victoria came up with a plan called Melbourne 2030, which attempted to define the urban growth corridor and said we'll have development around transport nodes, places like Camberwell Station. Well, the residents of Camberwell Station, or Camberwell, didn't want 5-storey buildings around their station, and the property developers, they wanted to keep going outwards. They wanted a new greenfield site, and the state government has essentially backed down. So the plans look great, but they ain't happening.
They ain't happening through one lens, but in fact it has happened, as Peter Clark reminded us, here in the central part of Melbourne. We have seen since postcode 3000 a dramatic increase in population in well-served areas of inner Melbourne. I think the issue is twofold here, Peter. One is that to get the densification happening in suburban nodes needs a lot more than just drawing up a plan with pretty colours on it. It needs investment in infrastructure. As one of my colleagues puts it, a sustainable city needs a strong bone structure. And we haven't made, as yet, the investments that we need to make, particularly in rapid transit systems, in order to galvanise higher densities in suburban locations. So we need the investment in infrastructure.
In fact, we're still trading in Melbourne and other capital cities on infrastructure that was built a century ago.
Absolutely. And the big challenge is that infrastructure investment. And the second big challenge is the way we govern our cities. At the risk of being slightly controversial, we've entrusted our city to a state government which has really a responsibility to look after the whole of the state. In a sense, its attention is distracted. And on the other hand, we expect local councils with local mandates to make metropolitan decisions. We don't have a democratically elected forum to look after the city as an entity in its own right. And let's not forget that Melbourne would be one of very few large and prosperous advanced cities in the world that doesn't have a metropolitan government. And I would also remind everybody that London never looked back after Tony Blair reinstated the Greater London Authority.
Can I comment on that, Peter? As a Sydney-sider, I think one of the big challenges that Sydney's faced, and I'm here to say it hasn't got it right, but it has actually worked very hard on that question of densities. And so that there have been some real achievements, I think, in that regard, that the densities have increased both within the city and certainly in many suburban areas, often against the will of local governments. So I think you raised the point about, well, who should be governing this? I mean, this to me is our biggest challenge. We've just seen an extraordinary thing happen, in my view, with health suddenly. A major shift in responsibility from one government to another. I'd like to just throw in for the mix, if you don't mind, what about, and I'm sorry to keep harking on history, but I think our forefathers didn't see us as always being 6 states and somebody thinking up a couple of little territories, we might add. If you look at, for example, at the US, where I think they started with something like 13 colonies and what have they got now, 50 states, we stopped. We did the 6, we had the colonies, and we've still got them in 2000. We do not, I suggest, want them in 2050. I think we have to challenge some of those precepts before we can get good policy, get good planning. Because I think no matter which position you want to take your growth, steady, slow, from an ecological point of view or an economic point of view, you have to have some better planning than we've got now. And I think that's the challenge for Melbourne. It's a challenge for all of our cities. So I'm with you on that. Let's start broadening the conversation, maybe.
Mark O'Connor.
I'd put a very different view. I must say I respond very badly to the phrase vibrancy in the mouth of a developer or even a planner. I think the only word that I find more disgusting is bustling. You know, when they say it's going to be bustling, you know very well what they mean. This whole notion that, you know, if only we had control and we could make people do what we want, we would densify their suburbs and they wouldn't be able to stop us. And there are a whole set of measures used, like amalgamating councils, which creates the situation where a councillor, even to get elected, has to have so much money behind them, they often have to be in league with a developer. And it just takes power away at the local level. In Queensland, as you know, Anna Bligh is at war with two major councils which are refusing the extra population growth she wants to push upon them. Councils are closer to the people and they hear their cries of distress when they get overshadowed, frozen out and clogged. It is hell when people redevelop a city in which thousands of other people are already living. It destroys their quality of life. And if the developers who do it had to pay for the inconvenience to the rest of the citizens, they would go bankrupt. So I'm not in favour necessarily of rebuilding a city. I think if you want densification, you've got to do that in new places as far as possible. But developers never pay the real costs.
Let me put this question to Chuck Berger from the Australian Conservation Foundation, because Chuck, I think the ACF would be in favour of the sort of city that Marcus Spiller described, one that's transport rich and dense, because that's a low carbon city. Surely.
Absolutely correct. We do need to vastly improve our public transport systems, basically decarbonize our energy supply systems entirely, and make that associated system of changes.
Public transport systems only work where there's density. They don't work in spread out, sprawling suburbs, because you don't get the numbers. You have to have density to have effective public transport.
Well, you have to have a number of things, and probably the most important thing to realise here is that investment never happens in a vacuum. It always happens in a particular policy and regulatory context. So I think to a large degree one's comfort with a rapidly growing population depends on one's confidence that government can deliver these changes very rapidly. Now, certainly we don't have a great track record on this. I think as we look forward on this issue, well, it requires almost superhuman assumptions about the ability of government to rapidly achieve the reductions in ecological impact that are required to accommodate a very rapidly growing population.
Marcus Spiller?
Look, I think the evidence is not there to say that these things can't change dramatically. I was a young student at the Board of Works in the late 70s, and there were reports being written then about the donut city, how Melbourne was heading down the path of US cities, the inner city was depopulating, jobs were fleeing, and we were creating enormous blight in the heart of the city. And this problem still afflicts quite a few US cities. Well, we confronted that problem, we solved that problem, and we delivered a marvellous inner city, which is now the pride of Australia. So policy and intervention can and does work.
The flip side of that, of course, is that we've been trying to put a price on carbon for 30 years now, and we don't appear to be any closer than we were back then. I think the tension here from a government's perspective has got to be that a lot of the business interests that are the biggest promoters of rapid population growth are at the very same time opposing the policies that would enable us to at least have a chance to deal with the consequences of that growth. So on the one hand, we have arguments about economic growth and skilled migration, but the very same groups will then say, but you can't restrict land use and you can't have a price on carbon and you can't do any of these other things. So governments are in a real bind there, and they don't deal well with that.
I don't think anyone's going to argue against that, and clearly I think one of our biggest challenges in this whole debate is how do we deal with environmental impacts and how do we deal with the fact that we are not dealing with climate change. And so I would totally support that has to be done. Whatever our program, whatever our future, it is clear that has to be dealt with.
Well, let me put that question to you, Saul Estlake. I mean, if Australia's population is going to grow rapidly to 2050 and perhaps beyond, how do we deal with the fact that we have a government that's promised to dramatically cut carbon emissions at the same time? How do you cut carbon emissions when you're potentially doubling the number of people who are emitting carbon?
Well, I think the best way to cut carbon emissions is to make emitting carbon much more expensive. In other words, like I suspect most of the people on the panel here and many in the audience, I'm a supporter of putting a price on carbon, whether it's through a direct carbon tax or through some kind of emissions trading regime, although recent developments would suggest that it's going to be harder to get that up globally than people thought before the Copenhagen conference. But I say the same thing about consumption of oil that Mark O'Connor referred to earlier. When we saw petrol prices go through about $1.20 a litre here during 2008, there was a significant change in people's transport behaviour. That's when people started crowding onto public transport, particularly trains, and governments have failed to respond to that by expanding the network, putting more trains on, making longer trains, all the sorts of investments that would respond to the change in pricing behaviour. I'm not sure that I buy theories that the supply of oil is going to drop precipitously at some point in the near future. What I would note, however, is that the oil price is currently around $80 a barrel now, coming out of what has been globally the worst recession since the end of the Second World War. And provided governments don't seek to impede those price signals, e.g. by subsidising oil consumption or by cutting taxes on petrol, as the Howard government did 10 years ago, the last time we had a spike.
Well, and also the Rudd government under its carbon pollution reduction scheme was going to reduce excise as the carbon tax on petrol went up. Right. So it was essentially going to subsidise petrol too.
And as my colleagues at the Grattan Institute have put out in a report overnight, the Rudd government was putting up an emissions trading scheme, but then watering down to the people at whom the scheme ought to have been targeted, the impact of that. So governments do need to use the pricing mechanism to influence people's behaviour and allow the consequences of that to go through. In the same way, if, as Chuck said in his opening remarks, it really is going to prove necessary to reduce our water consumption to 80 litres per person a day, then the best way of achieving that is to allow the price of water to rise to the point where people make those decisions themselves. If you need to rebate some of that back to low-income households so that they are in turn not worse off, then the increased revenue rates by increasing the price of water will allow you to do that. But I think there's an awful lot of history that shows that people will respond intelligently to changes in prices and taxes if they're confronted with those, rather than governments pretending that they can wave a magic wand and make these pressures go away.
Mark O'Connor, if I can put that question to you, I mean, what emerges from that is that the problem is not population as such, it's not the number of people, it's the number of consumers. In fact, if you look at greenhouse gas increases around the world, the countries with the fastest growing populations are not the countries with the fastest growing emissions in carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases, because most of their people don't consume very much. Now, so isn't the issue, if we're looking at climate change, particularly here in Australia, not the number of people we have, but the way we live?
With the exception of Australia, of course. We've got population growing at a rampaging rate and the highest actual rate of CO2 emissions in the world. The average Australian, by one of the usual measures, puts out about 26 tonnes a year. The average European about 10, the average Chinese about 4, the average Indian about 2. And that is one reason why when you move people to Australia, you're moving them to a very much higher emission lifestyle. You get this debate endlessly, I call it the gormless green objection. Oh, it's not the number of people, it's the way they behave. And we don't really have to talk about population. That's not the issue, because we can get them to behave so much better. The only problem is they don't actually have this magic pill that will turn people into environmental angels. And sometimes, as Saul says, the right kind of economic lever may produce an effect that is almost like a magic pill. But in general, these things are very intransigent. Personal levels of consumption are not easily moved, particularly in a democracy where the voters often will kick a government out for taking a responsible step like that. Kevin Rudd's incompetent policy for reducing emissions is a very good example. I'm grateful to Tim Colbatch, who pointed out a speech in late 2008 where Rudd said that we were going to cut Australia's per capita emissions by 34% in order to make a mere 5% saving in national emissions. Why? Because 34% is a huge cut, remember. I mean, there are environmental angels who might do that easily, but to get everyone, saints and sorry ones and sinners, dragooned into making a 1/3 cut in their emissions, that's an enormous change. But he said even if we did that, Rudd admitted, we would only make a 5% decrease at the national level because of Australia's rapid population growth. And as, of course, he was understating Australia's population growth, the reality is that not only are we swimming against this rapid current like a swimmer in a rip, the rip is actually much faster than the government admits, so there will be no saving. Rudd will not, in fact, be cutting Australia's emissions. It's a long issue, but basically we've talked for too long purely of per capita cuts. Yes, they matter, but if you concentrate only on them, they just become an excuse for the government to put more people in. So if you say, I'm not going to water my garden, I'll let my roses die so my neighbour will have more, that's not what happens. Mr Brumby will say, oh good, the suckers have cut their water consumption, I can push more people into Victoria, and you wind up with more people living on a trickle of water. The right way round, as the World Bank economist Herman Daly points out, is first you must have public probity on this. You must have some kind of parsimony at the public level. Then you can start to, once you've actually set limits to the population, you can start to say, and the people also don't need to consume so much. You can pull back and release the pressure on individuals and on the environment as technology improves. But at present, all savings in technology, or all savings by people's own moral decisions, are simply being squandered on pushing more people into the region.
I want to pick up on... I want to pick up on another issue that Maureen Horder raised earlier, and that's the idea that population growth and economic growth go together. Chuck Berger, she posed a question in her opening remarks. Can you imagine a city that keeps growing economically, becoming more vibrant, to risk using that word, without population growth?
Yes, the city is Oslo, and it has a growth rate of less than 1% in terms of population, but Norway's economy continues to thrive. A couple of ideas here. First of all, what really matters to individuals is not the overall size of the economy, so our GDP, for instance. Much more meaningful is per capita GDP, and even more meaningful are measures like net national disposable income, which take account of what happens to our built assets, ideally what would happen to our environmental assets as well. When you look at Australia's economy last year, for instance, our GDP went up, but our per capita GDP went down, and our per capita net national income went down quite a bit. So it's important to think about the right measures for our economy here. But the broader point is that actually there is very little evidence to suggest a correlation between population growth and economic growth. If you look at OECD countries in the decade to 2007, for instance, there are 11 countries which had a faster per capita growth rate in terms of the economy than Australia, but a lower population growth rate. So it's absolutely achievable to continue to have a vibrant economy. And again, I would come back to the fundamental question of why do we have an economy in the first place? It's to, presumably, to promote our well-being and our quality of life. Even as Australia's economy has been growing over the past couple of decades, people aren't necessarily perceiving that their lives are any better as a result. And that's because GDP is really a very broken measure. I think, as Saul pointed out, after the Victorian bushfires, the bushfires actually added to Victoria's economy because the cost of rebuilding homes counted, but the cost of the destruction of the homes by bushfires didn't count. So we need to shift away from a big stupid economy to a small smart economy.
So that's like, do you... So that's like, do you agree that we can have growth and prosperity without population increase? Because I suppose the opposite example to Oslo might be Japan. Japan has been stagnating economically for decades now, and part of that, at least on some analysis, is attributed to population ageing and population decline.
Well, I think Charles's economic analysis was pretty good. I didn't find myself putting a cross against any of the steps that he took along that way. I think it's certainly correct that what really matters in terms of economic growth is per capita income, and net is a better measure than gross of that. And there isn't much correlation between population growth and growth in per capita income, even though there obviously is a correlation between population growth and GDP itself. But most of the increase in Australia's per capita income over the last 40 years, and most of what the government assumes in the intergenerational report that will occur over the next 40 years, is driven by productivity growth, that is output per hour worked, rather than by population growth per se.
Us becoming more effective and efficient workers.
Correct. And I think that's a desirable objective. I mean, where I would probably depart from Charles is in not thinking that growth in per capita income, however defined, is worth having. I think there is, and always has been, a very strong urge in human beings for their children to live at a better standard of living than they have done, and for governments or anybody else to seek to suppress that urge, I think is very dangerous. If I can just say that the reason why Norway has done well in recent years is because they've got oil, and as it's become more expensive, the government has saved a lot of the revenue but spent the rest of it wisely in raising Norwegians' living standards. And the contrast with Japan, which is not a producer of oil but an importer of it, and has a declining population now, in part because Japan is so hostile to immigration, as well as arguably being the least family-friendly country in the world in terms of supporting women who might decide to have children, as fewer and fewer of them are doing, that Japan is an example of how difficult it can be to achieve anything in a stagnant society. I mean, I sometimes think of Japan as a country that has collectively retired. They are well off. Japan is a prosperous society, and people there live well, but they are accumulating massive debts, which they seem unable to grow their way out of. And while they can finance them now because Japanese are high savers, as more and more of their population actually retires in the sense that we understand that term, they're going to be running down their savings, won't have any way of paying back debt, and Japan is going to shrink quite significantly as an economic force in the world. Now, maybe that doesn't matter to them, but I would not want to live in a country which refused to accept any more migration, and which had all sorts of government controls on it to stop people having as many children as they want to do, whether those controls are imposed by government as a matter of law or forced on people indirectly by the way society operates, as is the case in Japan today.
I think the issue I wanted to just introduce, I guess, in the discussion now is it's really about the labour force. It's who's supporting. You know, we live in an economy and in a community which has an ageing population. I don't know whether anyone else in this room is immune from that, but I'm not. And I know that we're all being asked to participate a bit longer in the workforce. That's okay. But it is about who is in the labour force, what are the participation rates, who are the people participating, because we run the risk with the naysayers who are worried about the flora and fauna and forgetting about the people, that we get the thing distorted again. It is about the structure. And I'm really with you, Saul, on the idea that I don't think Japan is my ideal economy to be in. I think that we can be far more marvellous, not only here in Melbourne but around the country, about the way we face these challenges. And so I'm just wanting to put some emphasis on that, and that, I guess, comes to that issue of migration. Where does it fit in? But it is about creating within our economic framework the people who can support the lifestyle that we're wanting. Now, that's not to say, and I'm not arguing for one moment against the need for us to be far more sensitive to our consumption. I mean, there is no doubt. I completely agree with Mark on that. People just are extraordinary in the way in which we waste. We live with conspicuous consumption. We're wasteful. We're in the driest continent in the world. For goodness sake, why are we not managing our water better? And is it that hard? Really, is it that hard? We are able, I believe, if we put our heart and minds to improving the structures, to start to address that. And I think that's the challenge for us.
Okay, I want to come to our audience in a moment, but I know that Mark O'Connor will want to respond because you discussed, Maureen Horder there discussed the idea of ageing and the fact that there will be fewer people of working age as more of us retire. So migration can help to counter that by bringing more people into the workforce to pay taxes and do the things we need done, including work in aged care homes as we all age. Mark O'Connor, what is your response to that?
I think that argument is a scam. It was first put up by Peter Costello, this terrible fear about ageing. Now, I share it. I'm ageing at 1 year per annum. And ageing is a serious matter. I mean, ageing is what's going to kill every one of us here unless something else gets in first. And the spin doctors know that people are worried by their own personal ageing, and they've tried to get us to transfer it with this rhetoric about an ageing, decrepit society. And it doesn't correspond to the facts. Our society is not particularly aged, certainly not by the standards of the very successful European countries where the populations are much more aged. But more importantly, the basic argument they're using is that there won't be the workforce. There'll be too many old fogies unable to work. And it's just not the case. In the first place, half the time they're running the opposite scare, that we're terribly short of jobs. Do you remember when they foolishly sold off the Gorgon gas field? Absolute strategic blunder. And they defended it by saying, jobs. In Melbourne, I believe it's been shown that there are 5 applicants for every available job. And yet you get this contrary rhetoric that there's a terrible shortage of labour, well, not yet here, but coming. And this is mainly put up by large companies with vested interests who are very happy to put up ambit claims for the huge workforce they say they will need in 10 or 20 years' time. But I don't believe them, because no managing director wants to put on any more staff than they have to, because staff are expensive. And every year the cost of computers and machines that make people more efficient gets less, whereas the cost of staff remains high. The great scam in the ageing thing is to use a true statistic, as you may have heard, that every person in the working years will be supporting twice as many elderly people. And that's true at one level, except that most elderly people don't need supporting. The statistics show that up to the age of 75, the flow of money is the other way, from the old to the young. And that it's not just the old who can't work. Have you ever heard about the young who can't work? For the first 5 years of their life, not only can they not work, they need to be actually worked on by others, constantly looked after. Basically, up to the age of 20, most people can't work, whereas most of us can work up to the age of 69. I would think those are the real ages for the workforce. So the crucial issue is, what's the dependency ratio? That's the percentage of people either too young or too old to work, divided by those who are in their working years. And the figures show that by 2050, it will be no worse than it was in the 1960s, and probably a lot better than it was in the late 1940s, when I and Maureen and lots of other, a family of 9 young people were too young to work. And of course, what is this issue with work? If you don't actually have enough work for the population, and that is the current situation, then a person in their working years and out of work costs the taxpayer even more than a retired person who very likely is self-funded anyway. And I could go on. There's lots more.